we have a great demonstration coming up from Craig Timmerman, and I'm sure if you haven't, you should have looked at his stuff on our website. It has his bio there, and if you went to his website, you see some really great work that he's done. And I know he did a class up at Hunt County here recently, and you can look over here and see a couple of things. The one that Steve made is the maple one here, and the other ones that, of course, Sharon has to go all out. I'm joking, because she does such good work, and she made the other ones in the same class. So you can see that he does some great stuff. So without further ado, Craig Timmerman.
Well, thanks, everybody. I guess you're all here not wanting to watch a basketball game anyway, so that's a good sign. I was worried to come up here and demonstrate for about 10 people, and it's nice to see a full room up here. Didn't know what to do for this demo, so I decided to go back and show you how I make spheres. This is a technique that I actually learned many years ago from Stuart Batty. And it's a way of turning spheres that I don't see used very often, and I guess I don't see why, because I find it to be the easiest way and the most flexible way to turn spheres that I have ever seen. So it's the only way that I turn spheres. So I'll first go through all the basic steps of making a sphere, and then I'm going to show you variations that you can do with this technique that allow you to make other things from the spheres, and I'll show those as soon as we get done with the spheres. But you can start by passing a couple of the finished ones around, and we'll get started with this thing. I'll take this guy out of the chuck so you can see. I'm going to skip one step in here. But basically, taken a piece of wood and I've rounded it to a cylinder, and we've put a tenon on one end of that we can put into the chuck. A piece of wood needs to be a little bit longer than the diameter for your start. The first ones that you do of these, I highly recommend you do something about 3 inches, 3.5 inches in diameter. They're easier in that size than if you try to make them smaller. The smaller you get, the harder it is to make, not easier. And I'll show you why that is in a minute. But this size is a pretty good size to start with. I have made these as small as 1 inch to 1.5 inches in diameter. I might have pulled it off 1 inch in diameter. It's really, really tough for the one way that these get chucked. To do them much smaller than that, and I've done them as big as 8 inches in diameter. There's no limit on the size other than there is a jam chuck involved in the process at some point in time that has to be made, that has to be able to accept the diameter of the sphere that you're making. So the high-end size is only limited by you having another piece of wood that you can jam it into. So that's really all that. But like I say, if you go on my website, and you'll see some suspended spheres. They're sitting basically in a ring with legs. Those were all done in the same way. They're hollowed, and they're all hollowed with the techniques that I'll show you here with when I go to make the sphere box. The same techniques can be used to make hollow spheres. So basically, you say I've turned a cylinder, put a tenon on it so I can put it into the chuck. Now what we're going to do is measure our diameter of this, and it's about 8 centimeters, roughly right about 8. That's what we're going to call it. You transfer that diameter to the length on the cylinder. So here's 8 centimeters down here. And then we divide that by half. So I'll put another mark at 4 centimeters. I work a lot in metric terms on the lathe just because everything is a lot easier to divide in 2. So that's why I'm using centimeters, millimeters here rather than inches. It just, everything divides so much easier. So is that about 3 inches? It's about 3. 8 is about 3 inches. So the important thing with this center mark is the center mark has to stay until the very end of the whole process. Okay, it's very critical in all the steps that I go through that center line does not go away, because it's used to recenter the piece in a couple of the steps. So we don't want that ever to go away. From here, what we're going to do is we're going to rough turn 1/2 of the sphere. You don't have to be exact on with this, but the closer you get, the faster you make them. The closer you get in the rough size, the faster you'll be able to make the whole sphere, as you'll see in later steps. One thing that makes this easier, if you haven't ever turned a sphere, is that if I start back from where my last cut is by, let's say, an 1/8 of an inch or a little bit more, I want to finish the cut past the last cut by the same amount. So if you always think of starting a certain distance and ending the same distance past, you'll typically get a more perfect sphere as you go around. So if you think about doing that in terms of making your cuts around here, so I'll start at that first line, and I'm going to try to end at the first line, go to the next one, do the same thing. It's almost always that this shoulder is always going to be a little bit bigger, so I always go back every once in a while and have to make an extra cut there. If you can plan on making more than one in a session, you'll get better at it the more you do, because you'll get used to making this curve rather than just doing them one at a time. If you do a couple of them, your second one should be better than your first one on getting this curve a little bit more exact to 1/2 of a circle. I don't have to be, like say, I don't have to be perfect on this. I want to get it reasonably close. Before I take it out of the chuck, I want to mark the center point on the very end. That's another critical point to not forget. Sometimes I'll take these out of the chuck and go, I didn't mark the center, and I put it back in so I can mark this. We're going to use that in just a second. Now, from here, we're going to part this off. At the length that I marked on there. Yeah, I think we can make it work with this one. We'll try. I've got several of these. This is a jam chuck that we need to make this project work. So it's a scrap piece of wood, a little bit bigger in diameter than the sphere you're making, and it gets hollowed out with a similar curve to the sphere, but nothing's fancy here. We're just kind of dishing this out. The sphere, we're going to jam that in there and hold that in there to do the second side. Okay, it's real useful when you do these to put a hole in them. I don't know where you can see the hole there. That's so if you get the sphere stuck in here, you can take a knockout bar and go ahead and pop this out. What you don't want to do when this is in there is knock on the jam chuck while the sphere is in it, because chances are you're going to knock your jam chuck out of round. You're going to partially knock it out of the chuck, and you want to keep the jam chuck nice and true. So it's easier to have a punch-out hole in case the things get stuck rather than try to pound on this or pull too much on this to pull this out of the chuck. If things get stuck, the other thing that can be done, if this is stuck in here, you can wrap on the chuck. Don't wrap on the jam chuck, wrap on the chuck itself. Vibration should work its way out. That's the one way that you can work stuff out, is just by putting a little vibration here. This isn't going to change since this is screwed onto the headstock. It's this that we don't want to be hitting right here, because that'll knock this guy around. Now, even though have this guy already made, every time I put him on the lathe, I like to make sure it's still running true, because if I'm rechucking something like this, it's not guaranteed that that's going to be perfect. So I'll make another pass in here. Just to make sure that's running true. And now I'm going to use that center line to jam it in there and make sure that we're running back true again. I use my pencil to kind of line up here to say, and if it's sticking a little bit out, I knock it just a little bit more on a corner to put it in there. We're pretty close. Before jamming it in entirely. And then I put a piece of masking tape on it. You want to wrap the masking tape going away from you. Anybody know why we do that? Correct. So it doesn't unwind as it's going around on the lathe. Now, the masking tape isn't what holds it in there. The jam itself holds it in there. Okay? If you don't have a good enough jam fit in there, the tape is not going to hold it in place. What the tape does is, if there's any vibration, it prevents it from vibrating itself out right away. But really, the jam fit is what's holding it in there. If you've got any concerns at all, at this point, you can actually bring the tailstock up without, doesn't have the point in it. So I've got a tailstock that I've removed the point on. It can be brought up if there's any question, and you can just use it there just as I've got it up there very, very lightly, and I can turn the second half. Again, real easy. So that's what we're going to do. Now we're going to rough out the second side. It's not running quite as true as I want, but it's going to be close enough, I think. I can tell I'm not ending up at the end of my cuts like I want to, so I know it's going to be high closer to this end. We'll take a little bit more off of there. It's all the closer I need to get it. It's still got a flat on this end. That's not a problem. I'll show you how we take care of that. And again, before we take it off here, I want to mark the center on the end. Now, it was in this way, so our center line is here. We'll rotate it 90 degrees, so our line is now running parallel to the bed of the lathe. Now bring up the tailstock without the point in the live center to just hold it into that jam chuck. I'm not trying to jam fit it in. I'm now just, the tailstock is holding it in this case right now because it doesn't fit. We're not a perfect circle, so it's not fitting into the jam chuck. But what I am going to do now, before I tighten this down, I'm going to make sure, I'm going to hold the pencil line on the center on the one end and spin it around and see if it matches up with that pencil mark on the center of the other. And this doesn't, so I'm going to ever so slightly shift it, spin it around again. And now I'll draw a center line from end to end. And now I'm going to make a parting tool cut on that line. And I'm only going to make that parting tool cut until that parting tool cut is solid all the way around the sphere. That will be the outside diameter of the sphere that I'm going to make. But it has to go all the way around. Almost all the way around. A little more. Now, if you want to make a sphere of an exact, of a specific size, a specific diameter, cut this groove so that it matches whatever diameter you want. So if I wanted to make a 2 3/4 inch sphere, I would cut this deep enough so that when I put the caliper on that, that's my 2 3/4. Because that's the outside edge. When that's done, I'm going to color that in a little bit with a pencil so I can see it easier. One thing you don't want to do with a lead pencil at this stage is turn the lathe on and mark it with the lathe running. The graphite just embeds itself into any of the pores of the wood, and it's virtually impossible to get it out. You could be down to that line in the next step, cleaning this thing up to be a true sphere, and you'll see the black mark there yet. So just lightly draw it in. It won't go into the pores nearly as bad. Sometimes if you get watercolor colored pencils, they're a little bit greasier. They don't go in nearly as much as that graphite does. That's just kind of a feature, so to speak, of that. And we take that and we put it back in the jam chuck the way we had it originally. I always like to put a pencil up here and follow my line, and I'm always recentering off of that line. That's why we don't want to get rid of that. Get it in there. Tape it up. Now, I'll pass around a few examples here so you can see these. I guess we can. So, here's example of the jam chuck and half rounded. And we'll follow that up with one that's roughed on both ends, and then one where the groove has been cut on it. I'm going to pass two of those groove cut ones because this one is really, really bad. The rough turning on that's really, really bad. Anytime the groove is cut more than 1/8 of an inch deep, you know you didn't really do that good of a job in the rough turning of the sphere part. You do more than these, more than one in a row, you usually get a lot closer. I'm a lot happier when I'm 1/16 of an inch or less away, deep on that line. This one This one is bad here on the shoulder. So what I can do is, before I go to the final shaping point, I can bring the tailstock up again to hold this in, because I'm going to do a little bit more mass removal right in this area. It's just going to speed the process up tremendously if I take that off before I show you the next step. So I'm going to go back to my bowl gouge. You can use a spindle gouge on this if you like, and I'm just going to take a little bit off of the shoulder in here. This is a lot more of an aggressive cut than what I'm going to do next. And that's why I want to have the tailstock up to hold it in place. Otherwise, there is a chance with what I'm doing here that I could pop it out of the jam chuck, and I'd rather not do that. But oh. But with that part done, then I go to a negative rake scraper. This is a 3/8 inch beading, what's formerly called a 3/8 inch beading and parting tool. But it's a negative rake scraper because it has two bevels on it. And what we do is we go to the grinder and we grind one half of this tool. That'll raise a burr up on whatever is the opposite side of that, which is the side I have up right now. The side that you put to the grinder goes down on the tool rest, so that the side with the burr on it is facing you up. So all we're going to do is we're just going to scrape this down to that line that we cut around the other side. When we get down to where the pencil line goes away, we stop. We do that all the way on this one half. Now, if I've got a 1/16 of an inch or more, sometimes what I'll do is I'll do just a little bit of a push-in cut, a little bit in here, because that removes the material faster. Then I'll go side to side on it. Okay, we got quite a ways to go on that. Now, the thing about this negative rake scraper and cutting with that burr is that burr lasts for about 15 or 20 seconds. And then we have to go over here. Put it back on again. Come back over. Now when I do these, my grinder never shuts off. So I'll do this, and what I'll do is I'll shut the lathe off, come over here, put it on the grinder. By the time I come back, the lathe is stopped. I'll check to see how close to the line I am. Start it back up again. It all depends on how well I did on the rough turning. I mean, we should be done here in just another 5 minutes with making this. I think my other side was a little bit better than this second side on here. Now, I'm not going to go back to the grinder as often because this is mesquite. It scrapes really easily. Now, if you had something that was softer, I can get away with stuff on mesquite that I can't get away with on other woods. If I was doing a soft wood of any kind, if I tried to do this with hackberry, I am religiously sharpening after about every 20 seconds, because otherwise you're just going to tear it out when you're doing this scraping. With mesquite, I can probably do this whole thing with one sharpen. Now, it still may be a little bit rougher than what it should be. I mean, you can get this almost perfectly smooth right off the grinder without any sanding on it whatsoever. But for the demo perspective, I just don't want to take the time. Besides, our grinders take so long to speed up here that almost there. As you do this, I always work from the end on down. Once you get a place where the line has disappeared, like I've actually made the line disappear down here, you can draw a little bit of a line around your sphere to essentially delineate, and I'm pretty much done up in here, and say, okay, well, all I want to do is do the scraping between these two lines. I don't want to go, once the line disappears, you're at where you're supposed to be. Don't do that anymore, otherwise you're not going to get a perfect sphere out of it. That's close enough for, I've got two spots here that I still should do a little bit because the line is still there. But for the demo perspective, that's all I'm going to do so I can flip it around and we'll finish this one up real quick and go on really to what I consider the more fun part of all of this. So we'll call that good enough. What I would do at this point is I would sand. I would still take this off. Don't, trust me, I wouldn't call this finished. I just saying that for the demo, we're going to stop at this point in time. What I would do at this point is I would sand this half, remembering not to sand away this line, because we're not going to go back to this side. The only reason would go back to this side if I made some other mistake when I did the second side. Pop him out, reverse him, and we'll do the second side. Now, after you've done the first side, if you change the diameter of this significantly from what it was when it was rough turned and fit into the jam chuck, when you reverse that smooth side into the jam chuck, it may not fit anymore. We may be loose. Well, this is why the jam chucks are dished out like this, because all you have to do to make that fit again is cut some of the front edge off of this, and you'll reveal a part that's narrower than what the outside diameter used to be, and then you'll be able to fit it in and jam it in. Now, when you make them the first time, I suggest you dish them out more than you think is necessary for the size sphere that you're going to do, because when you get to this step and you have to make the jam chuck a little bit smaller in diameter, that's all that you have to do is cut the face down, jam it back in again. Sometimes when you do that, it's not deep enough, and then the sphere bottoms out and it won't. You'll know it when it doesn't want to seat in there. You'll realize that what it's doing is hitting the bottom, and you have to dig it out deeper. You have to hollow it out a little bit deeper, and then it'll jam back in there.
What wood are you using to make your jam chuck?
I've got Sycamore here, and this was elm. Usually you pick a little bit softer wood, but I've had jam chucks made out of mesquite and put mesquite into them, so it doesn't really matter. But I've always used kind of a slightly softer wood here. They seem to hold onto the piece, I don't know, just a little bit better. I guess because they move a little bit more. I don't know. That's just always kind of been, and for me, any non-mesquite wood is the scrap wood for me. So that's what I make the jam chucks out of, so I can save the mesquite for the stuff I really want to make. So yeah, I'll make jam chucks out of the sycamore and out of the hackberry and stuff like that. The problem is making it out of hackberry, sometimes they tend to want to move more later. And so the sycamore has been pretty, it's nice to have the jam chuck be something that's dry so that I can put it in my box and then I can bring it back out and it doesn't take much to true it back up again. It's best when they jam in here that they jam away from that. They're about the top of the jam chuck is about a 1/4 inch away from the line. it's just when I do the finish shaping here, you'll make one little pass on the first side again. You'll just go past the center to take away the center line. And if your chuck is right up against the center line, you can't make that pass. Otherwise, you're going to cut the chuck down and it'll pop out. So it's always nice to have them be able to be just about a 1/4 inch away from the line is my optimal. This one's a little bit closer than that. It'll be fine. This is where that distance from the center line is one of the reasons why going smaller is harder. Because the smaller the sphere is when you jam it into this jam chuck, the closer it needs to be to the center line to hold it in there. If you try to jam a 1-inch one a 1/4 inch away from the center line, it won't stay. It's just going to keep falling out and falling out. It takes me 10 times longer, it sometimes seems, to do the real small ones versus ones these size, just because they don't want to stay in the jam chuck very well. I think I've got... It's possible. I've never done it. I've never done one with vacuum. The big thing is just making sure that you get it centered, again. But I would expect it could work. I don't know. I can't think of why it wouldn't. It would on the first side, that's for sure. On the second side, the groove would be gone, so it would work for the second side. You're right. The other reason why keeping it away from the top of the chuck a little bit away from that line is that when you do the taping, the tape won't cover up the line like it's doing in this one. But we'll just cut through that when we get there. I didn't do this one any better than the first one. Sometimes when I demo this, it's like, gosh, that's perfect. I never get them that good in the shop. And here, it's just the opposite. So I'm going to quickly remove some material again here with the tailstock up. All right. I think everybody gets the general idea on here. I think I'm pretty close. I'll do one more pass up in here. When I get this close, it never works. I can't. My fingers aren't sensitive enough to tell this fine of a difference in here. This mesquite also has a crack in it, so I'm feeling a little there as well. So it doesn't work. On occasions, you're going to get it where you've cleared the line on one side of the sphere, but not on the other. It's got to be so you've done it all the way around. Sometimes if they're really, really close, I can sand it and nobody will notice the difference. Some of this is, when you're doing these, it really depends on what you're going to use the sphere for. A lot of my spheres are used in something else, so close is good enough. So they don't really have to be truly, truly perfect, such that if I'd roll them on the floor, they would roll in a perfect line. So like on this one, I'm pretty much done on one side. I've got a little bit more on another. I would probably make another pass on this. To try to remove that, and then call that close enough, and I'd probably sand it if I was doing one of my projects, because, hey, I just want it to look like a sphere. It doesn't have to be one. If I'm going to try to do something where I want it to be true, and somebody's going to be just having it in their hands even, I want those to be as perfect as possible. So those first two that I passed around, those are just for handling around. I'll make sure that those are absolutely perfect. I'm down at the tape line here now. So I'm just actually taking the tape away, and then I make ever so slightly one little scrape just past center on the other side, but making sure I'm kind of with the curve that I've got on that, so I get rid of the line, but keep the curve of the sphere. And we'll call this good enough. Like I say, there's a little bit more up here at the top, but I'm not going to worry about that. I don't want to belabor this part because it's just redundant on what we're doing. We're just kind of scraping down to a line. It doesn't get any easier than that, and there's no sense belaboring that too much past that. This one I can still feel a slight ridge right at center. So sometimes what I have to do is make one reverse back to the original side again. And you usually can tell where center is still at, even though you took the center line away. If it was really bad, I could just touch that with a scraper. Most of the time, all that takes is a little bit of extra, just hitting that with 150 right that ridge, and that ridge will instantly go away. So I'll leave that ridge in there so you can see what I mean on that. But that's the basics of doing one of these spheres this way. It's that simple. When I saw that, it's just like, I've just seen too much of the typical way of doing spheres is there's a cup chuck here, there's a cup chuck here, and you keep rotating the sphere and taking the high spots off. And it's just like, boy, that just seemed to be a lot of guesswork. When do I have it? How do I haven't found all the bumps, whatever. Here, as long as you just scrape down to that other line, it's a perfect sphere. I mean, or at least as Stuart said in the class the one time, he says, well, at least within a mil. You're close enough. And when you're doing some of the stuff that I am, within a mil is about as close as I care about. So that's the basics.